Michael, could I ask you for your thoughts?
Sure. What Reg didn't tell you is what I really leaned over to him and said is, how long can you keep a dean quiet? You know, your comments are extremely well taken, and I just want to put that in a little context. I'm actually an economist, an international trade economist who focused on development, and remember teaching my students theories and views that globalization or expanded international trade would in fact equalize wages across countries and would in fact lead to that, and use the same examples of Japan and Korea that you used right there. And what we've experienced is that that's not happening, certainly not happening the way we drew it on the blackboard. And so my students are probably sitting around and going, see, Professor Benarroch was right when he said reality screws up my theories. You know, I wanted to put a little context on some of this and bring together a whole bunch of points, because people have made really, really good points. And I want to play economist. You know, I want to put on my economist hat and tell you a little bit about the problem of the growing income gap. Something that was really began to be noticed by economists in the 1980s and really puzzled us because, you know, we were having all this productivity and technological improvement. We were having expanded international trade across the world. And our expectation was that, in fact, that was going to lead to a decline in the income gap because it was going to benefit those lower skills to improve productivity, that productivity was going to increase and improve across the board, not just in selected parts of the population. And that with international trade and expanded economic development and open markets, that we would export essentially our technological improvements, our way of living in a sense in terms of our standard of living to the third world, and that would increase productivity and incomes in those parts of the world, and we would become more equalized. And while there's pockets of where that's happened, overall what we've experienced, interestingly, is that globalization, if we want to call it that, has in fact caused income gaps to rise in both developed and less developed countries at the same time. So you're now seeing countries that we expected income gaps to fall, increasing at the same time across. And so this really puzzled us as economists. And so there's been a fair bit of study on this, and most economists lean towards looking at technology and the role of technology driving income gaps across countries and within countries. Now, why do I say this? I say this because I'm supposed to wrap this up a little bit and talk about potential solutions or things that I think we could start looking at. And I don't think you can do that unless you drill down and say, what is really causing these gaps, this to happen? And so what we've really observed is that a lot of the technology is skill biased, so that the skills, the higher skilled people are really taking much more advantage of that technology than the lower skill. In fact, at the lower skill level, it's caused jobs to disappear, which were medium or regularly good paying jobs at one time, and those jobs have been replaced with higher skill jobs. Not only that, productivity improvements and technology improvements have reduced the number of manufacturing workers that we need globally. So it's not just about outsourcing, it's about the fact that we have fewer of those middle income jobs that we had at one point. And so what we observe really is the middle class starting to disappear in a way, and that incomes at the bottom are not increasing. So I know we focus on the CEO's salaries, and as economists, I tend to look at it a little more globally. So, my wife always tells me I'm naive and I'm not really drilling down far enough. But the point is that the CEO's salaries going out of whack really is, in the context of lower income salaries not rising, really looks extreme. And so if you look at data, it doesn't matter where you look at it, you're not seeing the lower income levels salaries starting to increase. And so that's having a real negative impact on the economy. And in fact, it starts to get to the point where if you start looking at the effects of the financial crisis, and again, you move that away and say, okay, maybe that's a cycle, I don't know. But if you look away, what are the longer-term impacts of that? Well, the longer-term impacts is that we've redistributed income, significant amount of income, from people who had very high marginal propensity to consume to people who have much lower marginal propensities to consume. And so an effect on businesses is that we will start to see lower demand, over time. And this is critical because the market economy is driven by demand. And so if we start to redistribute income in a way that has a negative impact on demand, that will start to really have an effect on future growth rates, which are going to slow down, which is not going to make this situation any easier. The interesting thing about globalization is it's actually increased the ability of the highest income earners to command much higher compensation. Roger Martin, the dean at the business school at U of T, Rodman, has written quite a bit about this. And there's been much greater demand for high-wage jobs in a sense, but there's just not that many being created. It's not proportional to the number of people in the labor force that we've needed. So I think that if you look at those two as an economist, look at globalization's effect, even though the pure effect of expanded international trade, there's very little empirical evidence which says that in and of itself has caused rising wage gap. As a trade economist, I thought I could explain it that way because that seems to be an important fact, but it seems other factors around globalization. All of this is taking place at a time where we're really looking at governments and have been looking at governments to become smaller. So it's interesting to note, in the recent OECD study that came out, they said that, it used to be that 70% of the gap of income differentials was offset by government benefits and taxes, and now that's down to 40%. And that's, in fact, what we would expect when you see governments pulling back, but also when you see tax structures starting to shift towards necessarily wanting to benefit those that we see as job creators, right? And the reality shows that it hasn't been a one-to-one trade-off. That's why deficits in many times are growing, because we haven't created that kind of income that we had expected. And so, so we have this system that kind of took a life of its own. And as an economist, I don't want to talk about, whether this was, somebody sat there and planned it, but the fact is that it took this life of its own, and productivity started to really gain momentum, and globalization expanded trade. And over time, this rising wage gap starts to expand. And now we're in a system where governments are cutting back, and really, in many ways, they added fuel to that fire, because now the social safety net became a lot weaker. And so it has become a very big challenge on how to deal with this. So where do we go from here? I still do believe in the market economy. I still do believe that it's the best system that we have. But I think that we have to begin to really focus in on these issues as becoming really important and part of our business plan, and not to just think about short-term profits. Right? If we can think of the biggest problem of this crisis has been the fact that short-term profits motivated behavior. We need to move away from short-term profits, and we do need to think about the larger social impact. And so the tax system has to be reformed in many ways so that it can start to serve its original purpose. I mean, when you go back to Adam Smith, if you look at the role of government is really to come in and help when the market doesn't take care of things. And I think that this still remains an important part. And I think the benefit system has to be reformed. And I think the U.S. is the classic case of this, right? They don't have a debt problem. They have a tax problem. That is that they're not taxing enough, or that their system has so many loopholes that they can't raise the amount of revenue. They're more than wealthy enough to withstand and be able to afford the level of government spending that they have, which is on a per capita basis lower than all of us, and we seem to be able to do it. I think that access to employment is critical, and I think we have to think about it as a strategy to promote economic growth. And again, picking up on points which have been said today, it's not just about having a job, but it's really about having a job that pays you well enough to not be poor, right? And so there's a lot of things that go along with that, and you drill down then to the business enterprise and say, from the business perspective, how do we create an environment that really has those in the social fabric and the fabric of the organization. Human capital in the workforce, right? And we heard it from many people here today. Human capital has become the critical factor in our workforce. And so if we're going to solve the problem, if we're going to start to increase incomes at the lower level, then we've got to raise the level of human capital in society as a whole. And so that requires policies to promote skill and promote the improvement of skills. I think Germany is a great example of the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean governments coming in and having more educational programs, even though I think government should spend more on universities, but that's beside the point. Right. I think that, you know, you can do this in the workplace, but the point is that there's a commitment to raise the skill level of all of your employees as a strategy, as a business strategy to remain competitive in the marketplace, rather than the view of trying to lower your labor costs all the time. It's really about raising your labor productivity. We do a terrible job of this in Canada, right? We rely on others to innovate, and then we come in and try to implement them. And so, I think that there is a sense of trying to change that focus to deal with the human capital issues, and that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's been an unequal distribution of the way that technology in many ways has been used in society. You know, I'm not sure if, I know that when you read a lot of the writing around here, a lot of this is unexpected in terms of how we thought theoretically the world was going to evolve. But the reality is that we're here, and so now it's a matter of refocusing and really thinking about strategies that will increase the incomes across the board. And I think it's a strategy to maintain higher economic growth, or at least more stable and higher employment levels, and obviously, a safer world, because, we know the positive impacts of that. So I'll stop there.
We've heard about China a couple times tonight. Let me mention my favorite Chinese proverb of all time. The wisest man sees the furthest ahead. Michael, what do you see ahead if we don't pay attention to these human capital issues?
Well, again, I see this, I see us moving to a world where we're really going to look at slower economic growth, because I think that is part of the equation. There's some other factors there which I don't have time to get into today. I think we're going to see more political unrest as a result of that, and I think we're going to see more instability, and our ability to deal with instability is I think going to get worse. The case of Europe right now, where they run into a debt problem in a couple of countries, which, if you look at the value of the debt in Greece relative to other countries, it's really a drop in the bucket. And it's the same mentality that's kind of got us into this. If we were to see Greece and the problems they've gotten into, and we would look at first solving the short-term solution and then looking at a long-term solution. But what we've done is we've mixed the long-term with the short-term. So we've asked Greece to balance their budget today, which is virtually impossible, in order to move forward, because we've mixed up the short and the long. And so then you start to run into really major problems. Now, we could have easily gone in right away and solve the problem by buying up Greek debt to keep the interest rate low for Greece so they can afford while they restructure. And they were willing to restructure, but we didn't do that. And so what happens when we don't solve these problems is they come back to bite us even worse. So now you've got Italy, which is a rich country, which should be able to afford to pay their debt. And you've got Spain, which isn't even that indebted. Maybe it had a bad deficit a couple of years. Now it starts to snowball. Now you're talking about banks. And so I think the whole world system, the globalization has tied us all together. And so the housing market in the U.S. can have a negative impact on the entire world now. And if we think about it in that context, and you think about the fact that if we remain moving on this line, where such a large proportion of our population can't afford to live and is not spending, then you think about that no longer being no longer just hitting one or two countries, but spreading across the world. So I really think that we have to start thinking about these things more globally, and the major leaders of the world have to take the responsibility to set the stage for trying to solve these problems.
Thank you. Yes. We had originally said we were going to go until 7 o'clock. Scott, do we have time for a couple more questions, and then we will draw this to a close? Would anyone like to respond to anything they've heard tonight? Please. The microphone is...
Thank you. I guess it's kind of for all of you. We've had a lot of talk about, raising wages at the bottom and living wages, and Harry talked about I really like the pyramid metaphor, by the way. This unstable pyramid, inverted pyramid that we have, and how taxes and wages could help stabilize this. But another thing that Harry talked about was these guard jobs at an attempt of stabilizing the system as is. And I like the idea of living wages and raising everyone above the point so that we can reduce crime and reduce theft and things. But it seems like our leaders don't necessarily believe in that theory, because we see a lot of talk about increasing all these guard jobs, increasing policing and prisons and things like that. And I'm just wondering, how should businesses be approaching that, with our leaders going sort of the other direction than what we're talking about today?
How do we remain creative in an increasingly guard-infested society?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I think that part of it is that you have to look at the role of government in trying to move us forward in medium and long term, and that the role of government is not always to come in and spend a whole bunch of money, right? But to put in place, to help businesses move forward in a particular way. I actually believe strongly that one of the things that we have to start doing, and I said it already, is really a human capital, raising the level of human capital, and thinking of productivity and thinking of innovation as the way we really drive incomes to grow. And I think where the government can play a role is to really try and set policy and set agendas to create an innovating society. And I don't think we have that right now in Canada. Certainly the US, there's other issues in the United States. But the Europeans for a long time have done that. And they've created a generally very high standard of living. They've kind of maybe went a little too far in certain directions other ways, and so that's created some problems. But I think that the way we create living wages is really to try and create the kinds of jobs that pay those higher incomes. And to create those kinds of jobs, we need to really have the human capital to drive that. And we're in some sense a step away. And so we do get into the struggle of then trying to keep low-paying jobs in Canada and attracting those and protecting them, because we haven't put in place, and it's not going to happen overnight, right? We can't do that. We can't change that overnight. This is a kind of medium, long-term approach, but I think we need to start putting that in place in order to deal with those kinds of problems.
We'll take one more question right in the back row. You, sir?
This is for Mr. Defer. You own your company, and a lot of people are saying one of the causes of this crisis is that we have CEOs and executives their ultimate goal is to provide profit to the shareholder. Because you don't have shareholders, do you feel any pressure from anything else that would cause the imbalances that are currently going on?
Well, I mean, I'm a shareholder, so no. I think the reality is that I can certainly, and I can make some different choices. But what happened, for example, in 2007 and 2008, when the world changed, I can be doing whatever I like, but quite literally, the banks walked from our industry. And I actually had the choice of, although I was meeting all my requirements, I had the Bank of America at the time. This isn't generally known, but the Bank of America was having its own problems, and I realized how they were treating myself. And I made the decision at the beginning of '08, fortunately 6 months before Lehman Brothers, to get out of the bank. And I basically redid my own personal finances and real estate, and I, for 2.5 years, got out of the banks completely. If I had not, I probably wouldn't have survived, because our industry had zero bank support. So I basically survived until the last couple of years on my own personal assets, and with zero support from the bank. So what I'm saying with that is that you're part of a larger system, which operates to certain rules and certain things. Having said that, I do want to mention one other thing. I think there are some policy choices can be made, and Hari mentioned the fact that, or somebody mentioned that we had a Mexican option rather than the Chinese option. And what we've been able to do is, I believe in the idea that North America as a strategy could work, by using Canada, U.S., and Mexico, and maybe Central America to compete with the world. If you go back to particularly Northern Europe, back to Germany, I was in there in the early 80s. They had something, these marvelous German rules called Ostausschuss, which is sort of shot to the east. But they were in there 10 or 15 years before the end of communism, building relationships to saying, when communism ends, we want to develop that relationship, and we work the lower cost our economy together. And even today, Germany has actually contract workers from there inside Germany, which often isn't known. So the Germans and Dutch and these learned to work symbiotically with these societies, where they would upgrade the jobs in Poland, later on further east, and also to balance them out. So it wasn't only what Germany did inside, it's Germany's relationship to the region that was part of their success. In North America, the Americans particularly treat Mexico as a problem rather than an opportunity. We could have done equally well. Mexico is a fabulous place to work with great people. But we largely missed the opportunity because it was perceived as a problem rather than opportunity. And at the margin, probably several million more jobs could have stayed in North America by learning to do this. So some of them are strategically, we have to be smart. And again, I think in North America, we have not been. So it's not just that I can compete in Winnipeg all the time by doing things, but within regional other strategies, these are not subsidies, nothing. There were strategies available to us that were not used.
On that note, I would like to, Hari?
Can I just ask a quick question to Michael? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Michael has mentioned that one of the reasons behind this crisis is short-term focus, and the solution is having a long-term focus. As a business academic, when you do strategy research, we are looking at long-term profit is about 7 to 10 years, something like that. Short-term would be like 1 year or quarterly. So what is your long-term as an economist? I mean, what's the long-term that we need to see?
As an economist, as long as it takes to solve the problem. But I think what I was speaking about there was really the transition of what happened when your students and business students got out and became bankers, right? And that they viewed short-term in terms of what they had to pay for the shareholders. And so by maximizing that, they maximized their own compensation. And so, it really warped the incentive system. And I can't, I will be an economist here and tell you that I can't give you a definition of what long-term and short-term is, because in every situation it actually is different, right? And here, I think we're looking at something that's evolved over a fairly long period of time, 30 years. And so we're certainly not going to solve it, in 6 months or 1 year, because it's going to really take a change of direction.
Well, I have a comment on the long term that comes to mind that I can conclude with. John Maynard Keynes, he said, in the long run, we're all dead, right? But before we do that, you and I are capable of taking bites of elephants. So on that note, let us begin and continue biting together into the problems we face. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Let me tell you, the banks, we wrote off manufacturing.
Yeah. And you know, the businesses that were successful,